Lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening sky. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, Thou who hast by Thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met Thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget Thee. Shadowed beneath Thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another fabulous town hall presented by the Southern Delaware Alliance on Racial Justice. And this time we, along with the rest of America, are celebrating Black History Month. Before we talk about the actual celebration, which we're going to do by looking at what's to be celebrated here in Sussex County and the state of Delaware, I want to make a few remarks and then turn it over to our fabulous moderator, Alicia Jones. Despite the ongoing trials and tribulations, when reviewing the history of the 46 million plus Black Americans, one can only be awed and proud to be a member of a group of people who heeded God's words to Joshua, quote, "Be firm and steadfast." We know that our ancestors were all slaves in the promised land, a land that we cultivated and cared for, believing that our toil and labor would be rewarded with freedom and opportunity so that our progeny could live freely, to comprehend the present and to help design the future. We must understand our past. We must honor their contributions towards building this country, admire their determination to survive despite the horrendous conditions that would crush the spirit and the energy of the ordinary person, be awed by their faith in the spiritual deity from which they drew hope and still do, and above all, appreciate the strength and determination and courage of the centuries of our Black ancestors who understood better than those of privilege and power the meaning of freedom, equality, community, and shared humanity. We must rejoice in our survival and recognize that we are more than survivors. We are builders of nations, examples of fortitude and determination, leaders in every aspect of American society, from teachers to doctors to the president of the nation. We had amongst us, even for just a short period of time, one of the greatest and wisest voices in America, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said to all who would listen, "We shall overcome because no lie can live forever, and no absence of truth and fact can exist forever." As you celebrate Black history, use it as an opportunity to feel the pride of belonging to a race of people who had an indomitable spirit, the strength to survive, the ability and willingness to forgive, and the determination to participate fully in the promises of our Constitution by continuing to contribute their efforts and loyalty to a country that has yet to accept the common humanity that they share with their Black but fellow citizens, who made their power and wealth and entitlements possible. Let's not limit our celebration of Black history to a short, cold winter month. We know that acknowledgement, acceptance, and repentance are the first and difficult steps to racial healing. This is a long-term, at a minimum, year-round process. There is so much that needs to be done despite progress before we reach the promised land and the American dream. If we truly study Black history, we will find the solutions. Brian Stevenson says that hope must replace hope. Dr. King has said, "I refuse to accept despair as the final response to the ambiguities of history." Let us commit ourselves to make these suggestions realities. At this point, let me silence myself because we have so many fine speakers that we want to hear from, and introduce Alicia Jones, who will be our moderator for the evening. I don't know what else to say about Alicia, except that she is a dedicated ally and warrior, and has been consistent in her efforts to make history, especially Black history, important here in Sussex and throughout Delaware. She is to be admired for her tenacity in keeping the conversation going and in challenging those who tend to deny the value of Black history. So without further ado, let me turn this over to Alicia. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Alicia Jones, and I'll be your moderator this evening for tonight's town hall. Thank you for joining us as we take a look at Black history in Delaware and Sussex County. Sil Wolford is a native Delawarean who currently resides in Newark, Delaware. Mr. Wolford is a graduate of the William Penn High School, Delaware State University, where he received a Bachelor's of Science degree in Business/Administration/Accounting, and Rutgers University, where he received an MBA in Marketing. In 2008, Mr. Wolford began researching his family history and expanded that research in a total revisiting of African American history. He has been lecturing on African American history since 2010 and serves on several historical preservation boards, commissions, and committees, including the Delaware Heritage Commission, the Delaware chapter of the Afro-American Genealogical Society, and the Delaware Preservation Fund. Here is Sil Wolford.
Hello to everyone on this Black History Month and this celebration of African American heritage. My name is Sil Wolford. I'm a local historian here in Delaware and lecture on a variety of different topics about African American history. Today, we're going to talk about African American education in Delaware. Again, before the Civil War, as in most states, educating blacks or having schools for blacks was illegal. And so the evolution of education in Delaware and in other states is important to know, again, how we got where we are and how much further we have to go. Dr. Bradley Skelcher, who for many years was a professor, history professor at Delaware State University, wrote a book on African American education in Delaware, a history through photos. These photos were taken before the DuPont schools, and you can see one on the cover. And these schools were basically one-room schoolhouses. Some of them even had dirt floors, potbelly stoves, outhouses in the back, no indoor plumbing. They were funded by the community, so there was no public education or public funding of education. So education for African Americans was in a very truly primitive condition. So we're going to go through the process and not get us where we are today, but at least bring us through history. Everything and education included started here. Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy was a Creole. He was only 1/8 African American. But he wanted to avoid riding the Jim Crow cars in Louisiana. And the case got to the Supreme Court, and it was decided that, not only was Plessy African American, although he was only 1/8 African American, that he had to ride on the Jim Crow car. And it created the Supreme Court decision of separate but equal. And again, there were always signs, especially in the South, of, colored restrooms or colored water fountains or colored waiting rooms. But this, again, put into law throughout the country this separate but equal tradition. This is a map, and the red part, and Delaware is in the red part, is mandatory segregated education. So even if you wanted to allow black kids to go to white schools in those red states, it was forbidden. And again, we're talking a rural community. So sometime folks were living, 20, 30 miles outside of a city, 20 or 30 miles away from a school. And even if the black kid wanted to go to a nearby white school, he was forbidden to do that. Again, there were different gradations. Again, you can see the color scheme, and the yellow is legislature determined, and sometime it was optional, and sometime, there were no laws associated with it. But again, we're talking educated was segregated education. My grandmother, again, came into this system. She came to Newark, Delaware in 1890, and this is 35 years after the Civil War. She had come out of a boarding school, for an orphanage, and at the orphanage they taught the orphans to be teachers and basically rented them out. On Cleveland Avenue in Newark was the Newark Colored School. You can see it there. It was a 4-room schoolhouse. And she taught there for 15 years. And she taught there until she got married. And again, these were traditions or laws which existed that married women could no longer teach. And so she became a homemaker after that. She had to be certified. This is her teaching certificate. She just couldn't come up and start teaching. She had to be tested and certified. And this is her certifications. And again, these were in Newark, it was a 4-room schoolhouse, but many of these schoolhouses were one-room schoolhouses, teaching from 6 to 8 different grade levels in the class. She was a very good student. And this is a letter from her superintendent congratulating her for getting an A on her testing, and saying she was the only colored teacher who had ever gotten an A, and not many white teachers got that high a grade. Again, these are some schools from other parts of the state, Frankfurt and Blackwater. And again, these are not, very well constructed or not very well kept buildings. And again, these were pot-belly stoves. These were outhouses. Again, these were teachers with limited resources and limited books in order to teach. But that's the condition from which African American education had to take place. After the Civil War, the first prominent African American leader was Booker T. Washington. And he created what was called the Atlanta Compromise. It said, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand, in all things essential to social progress. So he bought into the separate but equal, or if not equal, at least separate community, black and white communities, and black and white education. He did get together with Julius Rosenwald, who was chairman of the board of Sears Roebuck, and begin to build schools all over the South for African Americans. This is a map of the Rosenwald schools. And right after right about 1930, 1940, 30% of all African Americans who went to school went to a Rosenwald school. That's the impact that these schools built by Julius Rosenwald had. In Delaware, obviously, we had the DuPont Company and we have the DuPont family. So there are no Rosenwald schools here in Delaware. And Rosenwald and DuPont took up the responsibility of building schools for African Americans. After he was president of the DuPont Company and chairman of the board of General Motors, he gave up those titles and he became Secretary of Education. And during his tenure as Secretary of Education, it was mandatory education up to the 8th grade for all Delaware kids. So these were rules he was putting in effect. Public funding of education. So black folks and white folks got the same funding. There was, again, this issue of building schools, and the state of Delaware refused to build all the schools for African Americans. So P.S. DuPont took $6 million out of his own pocket to help fund the construction of 85 schools here in the state of Delaware. This is an article, again, talking about $300,000 being spent for Negro schools, and it obviously a significant amount of money. The schools were 2-room schoolhouses, 1-room schoolhouses. This is a school in Christiana, which still stands today, and that's the Iron Hill School, which is now a museum. This is a school in Hockessin, again, which has a tremendous history associated with it. And this is, one of the very well constructed schools in Newark. It's the New London Avenue School in Newark, which was a 4-room schoolhouse, and where I went to school. This is the Buttonwood School. And again, I'm going to continue to mention my family. This is my father, who was one of the teachers at the Buttonwood School and spent 23 years teaching there, along with, in this case, the headmaster, Mr. Colburn, who was principal of the Buttonwood School. This is a picture of the Buttonwood School. It is a historic picture. There are not many of these around. The school always started with saying a prayer, saluting the flag, and singing the DuPont song. And so we, again, these schools again celebrated DuPont for having built the schools, and the chorus is, thank you, thank you, thank you, Mr. DuPont, for building these schools. This is Absalom Jones over in Belvedere. So these are the teachers and administrators there. These are some of the students there. This is a May Day celebration. May Day was a big celebration where everyone, again, dressed up. And so these are some of the incredible pictures. This, again, is a reunion in Delaware City where these families, again, who hadn't seen each other for a long time, got down and got together and celebrated their history and their school in Delaware City, and again talked about how it was going to the school. And again, this history again should be preserved, and more presentations like this should be given. This is it was the Booker T. Washington School, which is down in Dover. And this is an article in the newspaper, and this is a gentleman talking about meeting his wife there. And again, we're talking family relationships and marriage relationships and friendships, and many of these friendships lasted for decades. This is a graduating class from Booker T School. And there's a renovation that's going on. The school has been renovated, and this is the lobby. So if you go into the Booker T. Washington School, you will see some historic artifacts there telling about the history of the school and DuPont. Rabbits Ferry, again, many of us up here in Newcastle County don't know our southern cities, but Rabbits Ferry is a small city down in Sussex County. And this was basically a family-run school. The Jacksons represented at the time, almost half the school. And again, we're talking one-room schoolhouses. So, these were not, schools as we think of today. But here we have the Jacksons who were basically taking up the entire school. These are some other pictures from Bridgeville. And some of the schools, instead of having numbers, were renamed after significant historic figures. Phyllis Wheatley was a famous poet. Paul Laurence Dunbar was another famous poet. And this is the basketball team. Richard Allen, again, some incredible works being done to restore the Richard Allen School. Jane Huffington has title to the school and is in the process of renovating it. And again, we have to keep our history preserved and educate the next generation. The jewel of what DuPont did was the Howard High School. Howard High School was, again, we frequently say it was the only high school in the state of Delaware. Well, there was a high school on the campus of Delaware State. It was kind of a residential school, and you had to pay for it. But if you wanted free education in Delaware for most of the pre-segregated era, okay, you had to go to Howard High School. DuPont spent $1 million on this school in 1928, and $1 million buys you a lot. This is, again, a picture of the auditorium, 500-seat auditorium in 1928 for Black folks, which was just significant. There was a exhibition place on the stage in the auditorium. There were incredible classrooms available, which could seat like 75 people. And again, there were laboratories, large cafeteria area, beauty shops, barber shops. Some of these were vocational training as well as academic training. They taught, again, girls how to wash their clothes and iron their clothes and sew their clothes and make their clothes. And again, here are some of the students, working in a lab. And again, some of the boys working, again, on the sports field. And again, this is just an incredible institution that was built in 1928, and again helped to, this was called the Great Experiment. So this helped to move blacks in Delaware to the next level, and the next level was truly the level of integrating and equality in the state of Delaware. These are some other pictures of the shop and the auditorium and plays going on and those kinds of things. This is the first graduating class of Howard High School, 1929. And this is the faculty of Howard High School in 1930. And these instructors were incredibly gifted, many of them graduating from Ivy League colleges, Columbia University, University of Pennsylvania. Again, in the 20s, the best job a person could get, even with an education, was a school teacher. And again, these relationships lasted for many years. The class of 1953 of Howard High School, again, still meets with reunions. These are, again, families. What happened to the DuPont schools? We ended up with integration. Lewis L. Redding took what was called Beulah versus Gephardt and Belford versus Gephardt, and they integrated the Hockessin colored school as well as integrating Claymont High School. Another school, which was not part of Lewis L. Redding or Brown, was a kind of a communal community up in the Claymont area called Arden. And this is a picture of them integrating, again in 1954, even without Supreme Court decisions. The Supreme Court came along, and again, this is the NAACP legal defense team. We all know about Brown versus Board of Education. The schools got integrated. This talks about, the Supreme Court decision, which again changed education not only here in Delaware, but throughout the United States. And again, this piece of history is worth revisiting and learning. The Brown versus Board of Education was actually 5 or 6 kids from Kansas, but Brown was alphabetically the first, so it became Brown versus Board of Education. Integration was not easy. When it got down to Milford, there were objections and protests which slowed down the process, and many schools in the southern part of the state of Delaware didn't get integrated up until the 1960s or even 1970s, even though Brown versus Board of Education was 1954. There was much rancor associated with it. One of the gentlemen involved in the chaos going on in Milford was a gentleman by the name of Orlando Camp, who later wrote a book called The Milford 11. And again, I recommended everyone buy his book or read his book to remember this part of our history and part of our education. This is Ruby Bridges, who integrated the schools in Louisiana in the deep, deep South. And again, she took a risk of her life to do this. And she's surrounded by U.S. Marshals in order to get this done. And this is Ruby Bridges all grown up. And this is a picture of the, actual U.S. Marshals that protected her in order to go to school. There were other incidents, the Little Rock Nine, where again Eisenhower had to send in federal troops in order to get integration done. So we've always been fighting for quality education, for integrated education, for better education. And these are some of the historic steps that we had to go through to get it done. Some of them might not have been even legal. Someone said that Dwight D. Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, didn't have the right to send federal troops into a state to do it, but he did it and helped us get it to where we are. One of the students in Little Rock, Arkansas, wrote this book called Warriors Don't Cry, which talked about her experience. And again, I recommend these books so that we keep this history alive. Let me thank you for your time. Hopefully, again, in this short period of time, I've introduced you to some things that you should learn more about or want to know more about. And hopefully, this introduction will inspire you to learn more about integration of schools in Delaware or public education or the schools that P.S. DuPont built. Thank you again for your time.
Bryan Stevenson, a native of Milton, Delaware, is often called the third good marshal of his generation. He is a lawyer, social justice activist, founder, executive director of the EGI, the Equal Justice Initiative, and a law professor at the NYU, New York University School of Law. Based in Montgomery, Alabama, he has challenged bias against the poor and minorities in the criminal justice system, especially children. He initiated the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, which honors the name of each of more than 4,000 African Americans lynched in the 12 states of the South from 1877 to 1950. He argues that the history of slavery and lynchings has influenced the subsequent high rate of death sentences in the South, where it has been disproportionately applied to minorities. Here is an interview that NBC Nightly News anchor Lester Holt conducted with Bryan Stevenson on pulling back progress in perspective. I'd like to also add, Bryan has showed up locally in Milton and has done speeches, and we have teachers such as Hattie Bull, who actually taught Bryan at the Cape Henlopen High School. I'm so proud I have a picture with him. When I met him, I was in such shock and awe, but here he is with this interview with Lester Holt.
Black achievement is etched in the faces of African Americans who have ascended to ever greater heights in society.
We often look at that as a measure of African American progress. Should we?
Well, I don't think we can really appreciate Black achievement until we understand the flip side of that, which is the Black struggle. And I know most people think of Black History Month as a moment to kind of celebrate Black success and Black achievement. And I think that's important. But until we know the full story of the challenges and the burdens, I don't think we're in a position to really appreciate what achievement means. And in this moment, I'm actually hoping that we can do better at articulating the depth of the struggle, of the trauma, of the pain, of the torture, of the bondage, of the violence that Black people have had to overcome.
I asked public interest lawyer and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, Bryan Stevenson, to help us put Black progress in perspective.
When you just focus on achievement, it in many ways gives you a pass on reckoning with all of the things that have been done to make that achievement so impressive, to make that achievement so meaningful.
I first met Bryan in Montgomery in 2018, walking through the depths of a soul-crushing legacy, a memorial to over 4,000 lynching victims from across America.
The mindset is that Black people don't deserve the dignity of even being a defendant. And they would be pulled out of jails, they would be pulled from law enforcement officers, and they would be brutalized in this way. They lifted these bodies up because they wanted to torment and taunt and terrorize other people of color.
When you and I visited the lynching memorial, the thing I have to tell you that struck me was how recent some of those atrocities occurred. They weren't all 100, 200 years ago. They were within, the last century.
I think the first half of the 20th century says something really remarkable about the commitment of Black people to America, because you had terror lynchings taking place all the time. 6 million Black people flee the American South and go to Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland, not as immigrants looking for economic opportunities, but as refugees and exiles from violence. And yet in the midst of all of that, we're creating new ways to cope with the trauma, but to also succeed and achieve things.
And still breaking barriers today, but against echoes of the past. Consider the election of the first Black vice president came in the same year George Floyd died under the knee of a police officer.
We saw just a few weeks ago people carrying emblems of resistance to racial equality like the Confederate flag attack the Capitol. We saw people take a scaffold to the Capitol and put a noose, which is a symbol that traumatizes African Americans because of this long, unaddressed, unacknowledged history of terror violence. And that is just happened this year.
And then back to the opening premise of the conversation, the idea that we see the first black this, the first black that, and these incredible achievements. Are we putting too much into that on the idea that we're moving the needle in a significant way?
I think we will not be able to fully celebrate black achievement and black success until we fully understand the trauma, the injury, the harm. And so, yes, I think if you're only allowed to talk about black achievement and success, we will not get as a collective society where we need to get to have the understandings that are necessary for a healthy community. And that's why we can't look at Barack Obama's election and say, oh my God, we're now post-racial. We can't look at the success of a Tiger Woods and say, oh, we've made it now. We accept everybody in these elite clubs that exist across the United States. And that's why I think it's so important to understand the nature of the problem. The problem isn't that black people aren't capable of exceptional things. We've always been exceptional. There's been, evidence of exceptional achievement from the very day. I mean, those enslaved black people found ways to turn land into profitable agriculture using knowledge and skills they brought with them from Africa. I'll just add, I also think that when we talk about black achievement, we need to talk about the cost of achievement for some African Americans.
Stevenson sees Black History Month as a moment for Americans to dig deeper.
I want people to learn things about the history of the black experience that they don't know. I want them to understand that there were 2 million people who died during the Middle Passage and their bodies are at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, and we've done nothing to acknowledge that. Communities across this country say never again can we tolerate white supremacy and racial violence and lynching and hatred and segregation. Then we can get someplace that we haven't gotten to yet.
I recently had the privilege to interview Reverend George Edwards, the pastor of Friendship Baptist Church in Lewis. Reverend Edwards made his first trek from Georgia to Lewis in the summer of 1953 to earn extra cash as a fish baiter at the old Lewis Fish Factory and decided to settle here. Reverend Edwards and his wife Ardith Edwards are two of the founding members of the Friendship Baptist Church, where he served as pastor for 33 years. Reverend Edward is also the chair of the recently anointed African American Heritage Commission. I want to also add, when I came here, I didn't see many black people. So Reverend Edwards welcomed me into Friendship Baptist Church. So I'm sort of a quasi-member, and whenever they take pictures of the whole church, I'm included. I consider him one of my best friends and confidant. Here is Reverend Edwards. Reverend Edwards, I have a couple of questions I'm going to ask you. What black churches were in Lewis when you first came here?
When I first came here back in the early 50s, the only black churches I knew of was two, St. Paul and St. George. St. George AME Church and St. Paul United Methodist Church. St. Paul is located on 4th Street. St. George is on the other street over from them, so they were just two churches in the neighborhood, and they were both Methodists, United Methodist and AME. And Friendship Baptist Church was organized back in the early 50s when I came to Delaware. That was a minister that worked for Otis Smith, a fish products company named Reverend Pedro Phillips. He would come out to the factory where we lived, and he would minister to the people, and so I got to know him well by working with him at the fish products company. So then he decided that we would like to have a church to go to, because there were people that migrated from Georgia and Florida that lived in Lewis, but they did not have a church home to go to. So he went to Otis Smith, the mayor of Lewis, and he talked to him, and then we met with him, myself, Reverend Phillips, and another man named Deacon George Tate. We met with Otis Smith and encouraged him to looking at letting us have a church built, and he gave us a building that we could convert over into a church, and that's where Friendship Baptist Church started on Bunker Road in Lewis back in the middle 50s. And from there, we moved the church into Lewis on 4th Street. We bought the property because he told us that he was planning to maybe one day the fish factory would be out of business, so we had the church on the property of Friendship, of the Fish Products Company. So we bought some property in Lewis, and we had the church moved from over on the beach over into Lewis on 4th Street. That's where it started.
That beach now has recently been named Johnny Walker Beach. Is that the same beach, or was it what we know as Lewis Beach, the first beach?
Well, at that time it was Lewis Beach. Well, just both was Lewis Beach. They didn't have a name of Johnny Walker. They called it the colored beach and the white beach, or the black beach and the white beach. So that's where people would congregate. If you were black or you colored, you would congregate at a place called Lewis Beach, but it was just beach number 2. And the beaches were segregated at that time, so up until we had the name changed to Johnny Walker Beach.
Did baptisms, were they done in the bay at all?
Yes, because when we were located at on the fish products property, we would go up to the Lewis Beach and baptize. We baptized many people that became members of Friendship Baptist Church were baptized up on Lewis Beach, on what we call the Black Beach. And the people up on the other end, what we call the White Beach, they would come down maybe and watch us baptize people. You know, we'd have sometimes 10 or 15 people at a time to be baptized and join Friendship Baptist Church. So that's where we started from.
When coming here in around 2009, 2010, Friendship Baptist is the only one that has a sort of a hearty congregation. What happened to the people who went to St. George AME? And I know now, I believe St. Paul's is a private residence. What happened to the people who attended those churches?
Well, St. Paul, that church, they had a I guess you might say on their charge, there were St. Paul in Lewis, there were Israel United Methodist Church in Belltown, there were Faith United Methodist Church in Rehoboth. Those churches were under the same charge. So then later on they closed the St. Paul Church, and the members of St. Paul, they would attend the church in either Rehoboth or Belltown, which is Israel, or either Faith United Methodist Church in Rehoboth, or they would go to another church called, it's another Methodist church in Belltown that they attended until they closed that church down.
Is that the one that's near Lowe's, that sits sort of on the left side of Georgetown Highway?
Yes.
That little church, I always go by.
That was John Wesley United Methodist Church at one time. Then they closed that church down, and the people all congregated in Rehoboth at Faith United Methodist Church.
And actually that little church is almost directly across the street from the Nassau School.
Right.
Where DuPont family built schools for black
Right.
and brown kids. How did you become a minister? When did you hear the calling, as they say?
Well, my parents were all Baptist faith, and when I came to Delaware, we looked for a Baptist church to go to. You know, we would go to the Methodist church, but talking to some people out at Fish Products Company, and the Reverend Pedro Phillips he was a minister at that time, and we talked together, and we would have services on Sundays. We call it street service, because we would go, he had a little place that was set up on Bunker Road. We would go and the people would congregate around, and he would give the message, and we would sing our song, we would have script and prayer. And so later on, when we set up the church, which is our Friendship Baptist Church, we converted it, it was a bunkhouse, we converted it over into a church. We had it dedicated, and that's when we would have our service. So I just came up in the church as a Sunday school teacher. I worked as a trustee, then I worked as the deacon, the chairman deacon, until God called me into the ministry. I was called into the ministry in like 1974. 1975, I was licensed, and from there I just kept moving up. I was licensed, then I was ordained as a minister of the gospel. And in 1988, when the pastor that we had passed away, then I became the pastor of Friendship Baptist Church. And we had moved up into Lewis at that time on 4th Street. And so that's where I've been pastoring for the last 30-some years.
And I talked to Reverend Austin recently, and he said he was so welcomed by Friendship Baptist. It looks like he came and stayed.
Yeah, we have a lot of ministers that came to Lewis and they joined Friendship Baptist Church, and from there we just spread out. After I was licensed, then I was ordained as a minister of the gospel, and from there I worked as an assistant pastor for Friendship Baptist Church. Then I became the pastor when the pastor passed away, and from there I just kept moving up to, the Lord blessed me that I became the moderator of the Union General Baptist Association, which is an organization that oversees several different churches, and they all came under the Union General Baptist Association, which is now the Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Association. So from there, that's where my ministry came up until now.
Well, right now we're Black historians are really interested in Jim Crow. So when you had to form your own churches, were any blacks going to any of the white churches at all? Were they permitted?
At that time, in the, I would say like in 57, when Friendship Baptist Church were first set up and set into order, there were no black church. No black was going to any white churches in Lewis. There were only 2 black churches, St. Paul AME and St. George AME. And from there, that's the way it was just segregated. We didn't have any whites going to our church, but we communicate with people. I worked with a lot of people that Fish Products Company that were Christians, but we had separate worship places of worship. So
on Sunday, the most segregated day, they say in the week. The other thing is sometimes we've had times to chat, and you've told me 2 stories that I want you to repeat. One is about a planned burial in the cemetery. We haven't talked about the cemetery behind the church, so I will say a few words about that.
When we moved our church to in town, from on, we call it 4 Mile Road, where we had the church. We moved into town on 4th Street. We bought some property there, and in the back of the church, there was plenty of property. So there was the organization called the Highland Heights, and we talked to them about purchasing some land to move our church. So we purchased the land, and they said, well, you can buy as much of this property as you want. It's not in any use. So we bought property in the back of the where Friendship Baptist Church is now located. We bought property in the back. We said, well, we have our own cemetery. So that's what we did. We went into the process of obtaining what we needed to have a cemetery. So we got all the legal work done, and then we were able to set up a cemetery in the back of Friendship Baptist Church.
But the first person to be buried in that church wasn't allowed, correct?
Right. Well, now the cemetery that we have now, we had a problem getting it through, but we went through legal channels and we went to Georgetown and we got a permit because someone said that you cannot have a church cemetery in Lewis city limits, but there were several other churches that had cemeteries there. So we went and we got the legal documents and we went through the state and we were able to use that property for a cemetery because there are a lot of people that couldn't be buried in the white cemetery, so we just needed a place to bury the dead. So that's when we built.
Well, I'm gonna mention that the person had to be buried in Memorial Cemetery and then was eventually moved because the town actually stopped you from using it as a cemetery. And he's too gracious to tell you that, but I'm not.
Well, now that was most of the people that passed that I've known. There was a cemetery going to Rehoboth on Route 1. That's where a lot of the people were buried. I think it's called a People Memorial Cemetery, but there weren't a black cemetery in the town of Lewis that you could use to bury the dead. So once we got it set up, and that's when we started the Friendship Baptist Church Cemetery back behind the church.
Also, you told me another story, and I'd like to have you refresh my memory, but it was about a building that had certain significance that was going to be moved to the historical property to be saved. Do you remember which building that was? And you had arranged for it to be moved and everything?
Oh, yes, well, that was a building. Before that was the, right now, in the neighborhood of around 4th Street, Park Avenue, and those streets around where the most of the blacks lived. There was a building and they wanted to do something with it because they were using it. It used to be a ballpark. There was a ballpark, there was an area there where we had the Happy Day Club and another place called the Squeeze In. And then there was a vacant lot that Otis Smith owned. And they would play ball. We had people come from Maryland and even from sometime New Jersey. And they would come together on weekends and they had baseball there they would play. And they had competition with other organizations as far as the baseball was concerned. And so they stopped that and they decided that they wanted to make a historical area there with most historical homes coming in. But there was one building there that was, it has a lot of history behind it. It was owned by a lady that, the Stewart family. And so what happened is that we decided instead of them tearing the building down, we wanted to put it in the, up for history. And we would like for it to be a place that we could set up a building and all the black history, whatever history you had, you could put in that building. And when we decided to purchase the building, the owner lived, I think, was in California, I believe. And we called them and they said, well, you can have the building, said they was gonna sell the land, but the building, you can move it. If you get someone to move it, it's fine. We had someone that said it was a man that was a mover, and he said, well, I will move the building where you want it. We found out we could move it farther down into the area there by the other school, it was DuPont School, so we wanted to move it into that park. And we had permission to move the building, but then I think we got it all set up to be moved like the first of the week. And then that Friday, someone called me and said, well, they're tearing this little building down. I said, what? I came to town and I saw the equipment there. They were demolishing the building, they say, because they didn't wanted to use it, and if no one moved it, they were going to demolish it. So that's what happened.
I hate to say it, but this is only like the tip of the iceberg of what happened during Jim Crow, a lot with real estate where blacks petitioned to subdivide property. They couldn't subdivide it, but yet when white people or a white person purchased it, they were able to do much more with the land. And that area right now, we've had, and I'll bring up just the fishnet reel, where we're fighting to have it stay where it is.
Right.
But also that sort of ties in a little bit about, you might tell us a little bit about your relationship with Otis Smith, because he was a visionary, I think.
And one thing I will say that in knowing Otis Smith, he was always there to help people when they needed it, so he had a lot of people that came from Florida, Georgia, some over New Jersey. They came here to work, so they would work at fish products, either Seacoast Products factory during the summer, during the fishing season. Then they would go back. Then a lot of people would just move here, and they bought property and they made this their residence. And one thing about him, you could go to him and talk to him, let you know what you would like to have. So the Reverend Pedro Phillips' wife worked for Otis Smith, and she worked out at this mansion that he had. And so what happened is that we would meet with him, and when we wanted a place of worship, he said, look, say, if you need a building, take one of the buildings. He had it remodeled, and that's what we call the Friendship Baptist Church when it was first set up. And then when we got ready to move, he told us that I'll help you to move it, because he didn't know how long the fishing industry would be around here in Lewis, but what he did know that we could have the building. Buy a piece of property in town that you can move the building. So that's what we did. And for what I think concerning Otis Smith, because the park now that you have in Lewis, in the area where all of the historic homes are, he owned that, and that was like we had a ballpark. People could take their children on Sundays and Saturdays and go out, they could have a picnic, whatever they wanted to in that area. They could also go there, and they had set up with a little recreational parks that the children could go play, swings and slide boards. And this was right in the area around from St. Paul and St. George, and then Friendship was down on the end of 4th Street. So what happened is that when they sold the property, I guess, and they began to move these new homes in, well, then that was how it just changed things. So.
Right, but he, as I also understand, he didn't discriminate in terms of pay,
No,
right?
he didn't.
And he went to banks to give black people mortgages, right? And no red line or anything like that, because I found black homes on the other side of like Kings Highway and Chestnut Street. And
what amazed me concerning Otis Smith is that if you went to any of the banks in Lewis, and if you worked for him, all you had to do is say if you wanted to borrow money, whatever you wanted, they would let you have it, because they knew it was good because you worked for him. And every year during the fishing season, if you worked for him at the factory or on the boats, you got they call it a bonus, if you had a good year with a lot of fish, you had a bonus you would get. So people were able to send their children to college. I know many families that came from Florida and Georgia, came to Delaware. They would work during the season here at the Fish Products Company. Then when the season went down, they would go back down to Florida, and they were able to put their children through college just by working here, the money they would make, and go back down. Then they would go and work maybe in oranges and that time of the year. If you go down to Florida during the oranges season, during produce things, you could work there and you would just not move anything. They came to Delaware. They didn't come to live. They just came to work during the summer. Then they would go back to Florida, and then a lot of them came to Delaware. They migrated here, and they set up, they bought property, and they own different things here.
It was like a thriving neighborhood because it was segregated. There were hairdressers, cleaners, caterers, cooks, washers, laundromats.
And a lot of people came, and the men worked at the factory, and some of the women had jobs in Rehoboth at the restaurants during the summer. They worked in Lewis out of Rehoboth. They had other places that they would work, like I think it was Dressco in Lewis, and there was another, they call it Clam Factory. A lot of people went there to work here in Lewis, and you made good money. And you were able to purchase property, you were able to educate your children and do different things that you normally could not do, if you didn't come here around in Lewis. Lewis was a thriving neighborhood that I was seeing it grown from almost nothing. I was seeing it when there was segregation. They had one movie in Lewis that you went there, was segregated. The blacks would go upstairs and the white downstairs. Most of the restaurants in Lewis, they were segregated.
And I understand they served German prisoners of war, but black people could not go into those same restaurants and receive the same kind of service, which is, to me, unimaginable.
Well, we were able to get a lot of information because when I came here, I heard about the things that happened about the prisons, and so forth, and it amazed me how the times were changing. But to me, Otis Smith was a man that did not believe in segregation. We would, out at the factory, they had I guess we would call it the mess hall, like they do in the Army, so they would have, maybe you have your breakfast, lunch, and dinner in the evenings, and what he would do, it was segregated. The whites had a little part over there they would have, and then another little building the blacks had. So when things began to change in the early 60s, he said we would not have no more separate place that you would eat. Everybody worked together to eat together. So he cut out this
separate but equal. Right. Plessy versus Ferguson.
Had everyone to come together if you wanted to eat.
If you wanted to eat.
So, and it amazed me because by me coming from Florida and Georgia, I know how segregation works, and I know how people are. But then when I got here and I began to see people change, it amazed me how that it changed so smoothly. And I would go back to Florida, to Georgia, and I would listen to my friends talk about the problem they were having with segregation. And it amazed me because when I came to Delaware, although the schools were separate, they had a DuPont school where my oldest daughter, she went to DuPont school in Lewis before she went to Lewis High School, because the high schools were segregated. They had just a little small school. If you couldn't go to the high school in Lewis. You had to go over to a school called, I guess, Jason High School in Georgetown in order to graduate. But then before long, they began to integrate the schools, and that's when my daughter, she graduated from Cape and Lopin High School. Both of my two daughters and also my son. So it was such a change for me because I'm one that always believed that equal rights, everyone deserved that. And when things began to change in the early 60s, we would always go down to Florida or Georgia for a vacation. And we would go down, and then you couldn't find a hotel you could stay in. You had to sleep in your car. You got tired, you couldn't go in. My wife and I would get ready to travel from Delaware to Georgia, and a lot of people, maybe 4 or 5 carloads, would get ready to go down after the season was over, and they would pack the lunch. You had to pack what you wanted to eat because you couldn't go in the restaurants, and you could go
couldn't use the bathrooms.
You had to go out back to your bathroom. You couldn't go sit in the restaurants. You go in the grocery store and buy something, go home. So we would always pack before we would leave here enough to take us till the next day when we got down. And then when things began to integrate, we would gas up our cars in Lewis, and we make sure we would not get down to maybe a quarter of a tank before we buy some more gas. When it's a half a tank of gas, we would stop to this gas station and we say, do you have a restroom? They said, well, you can go out back. We start up the car and keep going because we had enough gas to go to the next area. And we would do that until we found where you could use the restroom. So we went through a lot during that time, I guess, in the early 60s until things really got better. You had to stop on the side of the road or pull up in a rest area to sleep for maybe 2 or 3 or 4 hours, and then you would continue on down south if you didn't want to drive all the way through. But then it got so in the late 60s where you could just go to, if you had the money, you could just stop in a motel, hotel you wanted to, and everything was altogether different.
Well, I just want to add a little personal note. I used to spend my summers in Maryland, in Salisbury, Maryland, and I remember seeing the water fountain signs for colored and white. I remember having to go upstairs to see the movies. So it was, and I remember my aunt trying to explain to me why I had to drink out of a certain fountain, and she couldn't come up with a good explanation. I've asked you a lot of questions. Is there something that you want to share with us that I didn't ask you?
Well, you've asked me a lot. But my way of life, obviously because I was born in Florida, and my father was a railroad man, so we moved from the place called Lovett, Florida, up into a place called Quitman, Georgia. And in Georgia, that's where I finished school in Georgia. But what amazed me was that I was able to live through the segregation. And although I began to learn more about it, but I learned that when I left from Georgia to come to Delaware, it wasn't any different. People would, the jobs were more plentiful. If you didn't want to work like on a farm or something, you came here, you could work in a factory, but there was still segregation. You could not sit where the whites sit. You had jobs that you worked together on the job, like I was a bailiff for some years. That's when the fish boats came in, they brought the fish in, and you work right beside some white person. You know, you pull in, you work on the pumps, you work in the factory, but then that was it. When you got time to go eat, you had to separate yourself. When you go to a movie, you had to separate yourself. They did not go visit each other at their homes, you know, like they do now. So to me, it was something that I was familiar with, although I didn't like the idea of what you had to do in order to be able to find yourself equal with someone else. But I was able to live through it without any problem because we stuck together. I used to go to this place called Happy Day Club. White people would come, maybe 2 or 3 families. They wouldn't come downstairs where all the action was, but they had a balcony. And I would see the owner of the Happy Day Club at the time was a white man. And he had these 2 black men that operated for him, ran the place. And they would go upstairs and sit to watch the people on the floor dance and listen to the music, but they couldn't come down and mingle with them. And I said to myself, you know, it's amazing how that they must have liked it, because they were there watching you, what you're doing, and they would see how the people enjoying themselves, but they couldn't come down and mingle with them. But then I knew what was going on and what would happen, so I was able to live through the change. And that's why now it's so easy for me to accept anyone. If you're a human being, I will accept you. If you consider yourself being up or down, it doesn't matter to me. You know, I see everybody equal because that's the way God made us. And I was able to learn from experience that no one is any better than the other. You know, you might have more, you might look different, but in God's sight, we all are equal. So I can easily adjust to the way of life because I know on the inside who I am, and I know on the outside what I see is not always what you get. So, you know, that's just my feeling about things.
Well, it wasn't only the Happy Day Club I hear that they used to go over to the pavilion at Johnny Walker Beach. Whites would go over there, as well as where you talk about playing baseball, it was integrated. So they felt white people did, you know, come over and enjoy some things that black people had. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I'm lucky that I continue to see you. I'll be glad when the church is open again. But I call Reverend Edwards not only my pastor, but my friend. So we'll move on to the next person. Thank you, Reverend Edwards. Our next celebrity is Jimmy Allen. He's a native of Milton, Delaware, is one of the brightest stars in the music industry. In fact, Allen became the first black solo performer to win New Male Artist of the Year at the 2021 Annual Country Music Association Awards. He also won the New Artist of the Year in the 2021 Country Music Association's Award. Here is a clip from the 2021 Country Music Awards, CMA, where Jimmy performed Freedom Was a Highway, a song about growing up in Delaware. I myself, unfortunately, never knew about Jimmy Allen until recently. But then when I heard about him, I investigated him on my own, and there are lots of YouTube videos. So I don't have to really introduce him. I'm sure most of you know him and find him to be a generous person who's participated in other fundraising events in Lewis. Here is the YouTube video.
Sunset through windshield, I can see it now like a picture in a frame. The blue jeans and t-shirts, who we wore it like a name. I wish I could go back to those days when the town was the whole world and love was the girl next door. The soundtrack was a song in the dark. I miss those days when our dreams were never chasing. The time was better wasted. We were summer young and living for Friday. And freedom was a highway. Freedom was a highway. Barbed wire on a fence post with the cross went on a road no one was on. Yeah, yeah, yeah. 5 deep with our hands up, just singing along to a country song. I wish I could rewind and replay when the town was the whole world and love was the girl next door. The soundtrack was a song in the dark. I miss those days when our dreams were never chasing. The time was better wasted. We were summer young and living for Friday. And freedom was a highway. And freedom was a highway, yeah. 'Cause when you're 17 and
Trina Brown Hicks was born and raised in Lewis, Delaware. She has worked for TRICARE at Dover AFB for 20 years as a health systems manager for Humana Government Business. Brown Hicks is a graduate of Delaware State College, now University, and a member of Trinity Faith Christian Center. She is a commissioner with the Lewis African American Heritage Commission and a member of the Ad Hoc Police Committee. In addition, she handles social media communications for the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice. Finally, and most importantly, she is a wife, mother, and grandmother. And now let's all enjoy this special presentation from Miss Brown Hicks. Okay.
Hello. I would like to thank Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice for allowing me this opportunity to discuss Black social life here in Lewis. Let's begin. First, let me just tell you, I'm going to come from the perspective of my own personal reflections while growing up in Lewis, both as a child and now as an adult, along with some research I found about my own family. In addition, from time to time, I may repeat an oral history memory that were shared with me from my grandparents, parents, neighbors, and friends, some confirmed and some not confirmed. So let us begin. Wow, look at all those names. Lockwood, Raleighs, Hollands, Browns, Wilbanks, Downings, McLeans, Bowdens, Gibbs, and so many others unnamed here. These are all names of Black families that were once Lewis families. They lived west of 4th Street and other streets, now proudly renamed Martin Luther King Jr. Way. Where are they now? Many have passed away, many have moved away, and many have sold away for greener pastures when the pastures here were no longer viable. And yes, gentrification is a long and repeated outcome of the history of west of 4th Street. Now, let me give you a little background of my own history. So, in the beginning, this is my father, Isaac Brown. He was born in a small county in Northumberland County, Virginia in 1919. My father ended up in Lewis by way of the fishing industry, as did many others. This is actually the only picture I have of him as a child in front of a one-room schoolhouse. He only had a 9th grade education. And as it was with most Blacks, that's all they could obtain, if any at all. In addition, this is my mother, Beatrice Williams, who was born in Philadelphia in 1924. This is her when she was 15 years old. After finishing high school, as a young adult, she was able to attend a trade school and gain her license as a beautician. This, at the bottom, you'll see her entry form to take the test and also a screenshot of her actual license that she obtained. Now, let's talk about my grandfather. My grandfather, Marshall Lockwood, was born and raised in Lewis in 1901. According to the 1920 census, for a short time, my grandfather lived in Wilmington, Delaware. His residence at the age of 19 was the Newcastle work home, where he worked as a hod carrier. I had to look up and find out what a hod carrier was. It was someone who carried bricks or mortar from one spot to another, and the hod is the actual item on his shoulder. And I found out the Newcastle work home, yeah, that was prison at the age of 19. Some might say, why are you telling that? Because history is history, and I'm about the truth. So then in the 1940 census, my grandfather lived and worked in Philadelphia for a catering business. This is him. The 1, 2, 3, he is 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth from the left. This is where he met my grandmother, Beatrice Williams. We also known her as Sugar Bee. And to backtrack, my grandfather, a big man, he was also known as Slim. Why? Because he was tall and big. Why was he known as Slim? I do not know. But that was his nickname. So let's talk about my grandmother a little bit. This is she. And they met at the catering business. And this was her ID. And on her ID, it says restaurant hygiene worker. Well, I take that as being kitchen staff or cleanup crew. And this is them together. Now, it must have been love because they ended up in Lewis, and that's where they lived and died. So I'm glad they lived here. Moving on. Okay, let's talk a little bit about life in Lewis. Well, let me just say this first. There's what you know, there's what you thought you knew, and then there's what you find out along the way, good, bad, or just is. When it comes to my parents and grandfathers and our history, you find out things that you never knew before, which is all right. My mother and father met here in Delaware. I was born in October of 1963, the same year that there was a March on Washington, which my sister attended, by the way. And I was born on Delaware State's homecoming in October. My mother was 40 years old when I was born, and my oldest sister was 18, so there was a great span of age difference. Growing up in Lewis, life in Lewis, from my perspective, was the best. Looking back, I never felt that I missed anything being part of a mostly segregated community. We just enjoyed family, friends, and sometimes entertained strangers. Lewis may not have been the Black Wall Street, but the community was for the most part self-contained. Growing up in Lewis, most Blacks lived from Chestnut Street, West 4th Street, Park Avenue, Johnson, Painter, DuPont, Burton's, and Pollitttown, now called New Road, but back then we called it Pollitttown. Now, Kings Highway only had one Black family, which was Mr. Fred Thomas. He was the Black school principal. On Coleman Avenue, which we also call Pigtail Alley, we had a Black family or two. Now, I remember being told a story of Mr. Fred Thomas, the Black principal who purchased his home on Kings Highway. He had to have a white gentleman buy it first because no one wanted Blacks on Kings Highway at that time. No neighbors wanted them to live near him. Mr. Thomas had a white gentleman obtained a loan and purchased the house, turned around and sold it to Mr. Thomas. That is how he was the only Black to live on Kings Highway. Now, is that a true story? I can't say, but as of today, it remains basically the same. Unbelievably, some residents also owned property right across from the canal, which is now Front Street. A story was told that the mayor at the time, who was Al Stango, wanted to approve Blacks to own and lease on the canal side, just like the white residents. But later it was reversed by the all-white council at the time. Mayor Al Stango approved the lease to Blacks, but all the white city council overturned his approval. I'm hoping to gather more information about that as well. So although there is this picture perfect Lewis in the minds of some, it was not picture perfect. There were some elements, various levels of racism and discrimination. Nevertheless, I can say parents of the Black community protected their children from experiencing it as much as they could. Growing up, there were dirt roads, pathways, alleyways, cuts, nicks and crannies. There were woods, chicken pens, dogs roamed the street freely. Many folks had gardens. The dogs would chase you if they knew you didn't belong on that street. West of 4th Street, everyone knew each other. Most were related by blood or related by marriage, somewhere down the road. So if someone called you cousin, you most likely were, even if you didn't know it. There was some sense of real community. Everyone stopped to talk to each other when passing by. Everyone visited each other's home. And at one time or another, the homes were much, much different. They were small and quaint then. Some better conditioned than others, but no one looked down on anyone in the community. There were good times in those homes to be had. Children knew their place or went outside when the adults got together. I remember many pinochle games in my home until 2 a.m., lots of cigarette smoke, and if anyone wanted anything to drink, you best believe it was available. News traveled like wildfire in the community. If anyone died, the community saw to it that the family was taken care of. People selling dinners from their homes got around by the word of mouth. If anyone was hungry, you were fed. My grandmother always had a pot of greens, beans, soup, or goulash on the stove. When someone would come to town, they knew where to go. She would leave the door open, even if she wasn't home. Anyone can come in and sit down and grab a bowl. And oh yeah, she made the best homemade wine. By the way, side note, I can make that wine too. She had a grapevine as tall as 6 foot for anyone to pick, but watch out for those bees because they like the grapes as well. You could come sit down at any picnic table in anyone's yard or on their porch, even if they weren't home. And when they came up and saw you sitting there, they would just come out and sit with you. And the picture that you see here is people enjoying themselves in their homes, on the front porches, and underneath the trees. This next picture is what I mentioned of the fishermen. My father was one of the fishermen, and we're going to talk about the businesses and occupations now. So let's talk about that. Taxi cabs, beauty shops, barbershops, catering businesses, community watering holes, Corsi Cleaners, Thelma's Restaurants, general stores, automotive repair, Dunning gas station, Allen Ray's, Squeeze and Bees, the Happy Day Club, a funeral director, school bus operators, cake decorating, custodial, and yes, fishing. All were occupations. All or most were Black owned. The fishing industry wasn't Black owned, but Blacks worked there. So when I said it was self-contained, it was self-contained. And although my sister experienced the effects of segregation at not being able to sit at lunch counters, my experience was somewhat different. I'm not saying I didn't experience some things as far as segregation was concerned, but I remember walking in stores and being followed. And while the Black kids were being followed in those stores that were uptown on 2nd Street, the white kids would walk in and steal right from under the nose. And then when everybody met up in the alley, they would share what they stole with the Black kids. So these are pictures of the barbershop where the barbershop used to be on 3rd and Park Avenue, and on Park Avenue in West 4th Street is the restaurant, Thelma's Restaurant. And this was one of the catering businesses owned by Mr. Roy Holland. Some of the Black businesses in Lewis at the time. So let's talk about the churches. Church life played the most important role in the Lewis Black community. Everyone went to church at one time or another, if not in life, in death. We learned life lessons in church. We learned how to be part of the community. Having various programs and dinners to raise money or anything that the church needed. There were 2 main churches in Lewis, St. George AME Church and St. Paul AME Church, and later Friendship Baptist, and much later Trinity Faith Christian Center. The men and women were serious about their churches. Here's another picture of St. George, and it was about in the early or late 1800s or early 1900s, as you can see by the vehicle that's in front of the church. And the next picture is, you can see, this was in the 70s, I believe. You can see that the young people department, this was the young people department. You can see how many young children and teens there were. So you know the town was full of African Americans, just by the children that were here. Talk about work life a little bit. Many of the men who came to live in Lewis relocated from other states due to the fishing industry. Many came from Florida, Louisiana, Maryland, and the Carolinas, and Georgia. As mentioned before, my father came from Virginia. He worked in the fishing industry. Others worked at the clam factory. And this is a picture of the fish factory. So did the women work? Yeah, they worked. Some of them. Many of the women worked at the sports craft, which was later known to be Dress Co. Or it was a clothing factory. They worked as seamstresses and other jobs, anything that could make a dress or pair of pants, they did it. And some men worked there as well. The Lewis community was a working community. One fond memory I have is when the whistle would blow at 7 a.m., you knew to be at work. When it blew at 12, you knew it was lunchtime. At 1 o'clock, you knew to be back from lunch. And at 5 o'clock, it was time to come home. Recreation life in Lewis and social life. Well, look what we have here. The field, now known as Ship Carpenter Square, was the hub of activity for Black folk in Lewis and white folks as well. Jason Marching Band would march up and down in the field in their homecoming parades. The Jolly Jills, which was the women's auxiliary, sponsored the playground equipment that was in the square. Sliding boards, merry-go-rounds, and other equipment. This is another picture of Jason marching down 2nd Street. And then another picture of the band in the field. And in the back, the building in the back was the Happy Day Club, which we'll talk about shortly. Another form of recreation was the movie theater. Of course, at that time, the movie theater was segregated. Blacks sat up top in the balcony and whites sat downstairs. And I happened to find out what peanut gallery meant. It was where, because the movie theater was segregated and the snack was peanuts, they were called, that's where you say sitting in the peanut gallery comes from, or the peanut gallery. Well, Blacks didn't care whether they sat up there because all they would do was throw the peanuts down at the white people. That's what they did. So let's move on. Another form of recreation, the beach. I'm silent because it doesn't take much. Yes, this was at what was formerly known as Beach Number 1, now known as Savannah Beach. It was segregated, but we didn't care because we had the colored beach, also known as the Black Beach or Johnny Walker's Beach, and Bunkers Row. Now, although the beach was segregated, beach life was as important as going to church. It was an everyday thing for Blacks, especially in the summer. Johnny Walker's in the pavilion was the place to be if you were a teen or young adult, with music, bands, and food. And this picture is a picture of the children on the beach. The next one is my father. He always had a Cadillac. And that was the Johnny Walker's restaurant in the back. And this was what was called Bunkers Row, kids playing, which was an area where housing was at one time for the fishing industry, the residents that would work at the fishing industry had housing. And then you can see the fishing factory in the background. So now we come to the Happy Day Club, another form of recreation. The Happy Day Club was located at the corner of 4th and DuPont. Adults 21 years old and older could attend, but believe me, younger kids tried to sneak in and they were always caught and kicked out. The Happy Day Club previously was known as Robinson's Coliseum, owned at one time, it was a DuPont property. It was sold to my grandfather, Marshall Lockwood, for $275. So he went from prison at 19 to his own business. I do not have time to share the humble beginnings of the Happy Day Club. I can save that for another time. But I will say the Happy Day Club was part of the Chitlin circuit, where people would, who were not so famous, would come and visit. It was said that Fats Domino and James Brown visited the Happy Day Clubs. And when I asked other people who else may have visited, I was told the Continentals, Little Freddie King, and the Upsetters, who was the Upsetters were the band for Little Richard. And they also visited Rosedale Beach and some other beaches like Carr's Beach and Sparrows Beach. After my grandparents' death, it later became my parents' business in the 70s and 80s. So I have a picture of that. So this is a picture of my mother in the old Happy Day Club and my father in the old Happy Day Club with my mother. And look at that process that he had in his hair. And in the background, there was an old wooden stove. And for that big building, there was 2 wooden stoves that I remember as a child. And after my parents became owners, it was remodeled. And you can see the newer look of the Happy Day Club. And then my father went into business with some of his friends in the neighborhood, and under the name of BMSW, which was Brown, which was my dad's name, last name, Smith, McLean, and Washington. So that was the former mayor, George Smith, and Tom McLean and Collins Washington. What would the Happy Day Club be without a baseball team? Well, here's the baseball team. And my father in the background with that black hat on the far right. The Happy Day baseball team was one of the best teams in the circuit back then. And I would follow my father everywhere. every baseball game. So I learned to love the game of baseball as well. And I don't want to forget that the Happy Day Club's baseball field was actually Ship Carpenter Square. I wanted to show this picture simply because many people don't remember that there was a hotel here in Lewis in the Black section. It was a DuPont hotel, and I'm told that my grandfather had influence in getting it built. And it wasn't a hotel where like a resort hotel that you stayed in a few nights and left. This was actually like a rooming house. So people lived there year round. And I'm trying to find additional information about that because it doesn't seem to be anything that's, I probably have to go into some land records in order to find more information about that. But there was a hotel in Lewis where Blacks lived in. Okay. Let's talk about schools a little bit. This was the Nassau School for Colored Children at 5 Points. But there was also a school here in Lewis for colored children. This was where children from 1st to 8th or 9th grade got their first formal education. And this house was on, I believe the address is 307 Park Avenue. And you can see there's a picture of the students, but also the house as it looks now. It's now a home. It's been remodeled into a home, but this is the chalkboard that was once in that old Black schoolhouse, and the steeple as well. And this is a picture of the Jason yearbooks. I have several of the yearbooks still from when my sister went to Jason, William C. Jason. And this was a picture of DuPont School right here on DuPont Avenue. The school was a Black school at one time. And the parents who oversaw some of the students there, of course, the parents were very involved. And this was Frederick Thomas, the principal, who was a teacher there at one time, and then also in the beloved Miss Mary Holmes as well, Jones, who taught many of the African-American students, and they have fond memories of her even till this day, and of Mr. Thomas. Politics. Blacks were involved in politics back then. There were Mayor Smith, who became the mayor, but he's also an lifelong educator. And he was a military man, and also Mr. Tom McLean, who was part of the Board of Public Works. There were also others who were very involved. My grandfather was also very involved in politics back then. In fact, my grandfather, I'm told that he was very influential in the city. When the white politicians needed help from the Black community, they would call him. A vote and a half pint would get things done. My grandfather would gather the people, mainly menfolk, and take them to vote. I really never thought about being involved in city government until Mayor Smith asked me to be part of the Ethics Commission a very long time ago. And he was a great mentor and influence in my life. I hold him in high regard, and not only as a neighbor, but he and his wife virtually raised me, especially when my parents were working so hard, running the Happy Day Club. So what have we lost? I think we lost a lot. We lost mostly the African-American community is gone. This is a family that was once here. Some of them are still living, some of them living other places. But this was large families, that we had large families back then who lived here. But now there are less than 10, probably 10 original families left in the neighborhood out of hundreds. And for me personally, I don't feel the closeness that I once had in my community. There's a sense of loss. So the only thing that I can do is try to hold on to some memories, make new memories, and keep them alive. The housing market has priced those working class families out of ever returning to Lewis. There is little to no children in the neighborhood when there once were hundreds. And this is a picture of one of the homes that was recently demolished in the neighborhood. Is one of the original Black-owned homes that was left, I believe, on Park Avenue. There's a couple, but there's one of the original left that was demolished recently. So it's been a great loss. And although there's been great loss, I don't think what we found can measure up to what was lost. But we do have the Lewis African American Heritage Commission that was established by Mayor and City Council back in 2020. And we are trying to make sure that those memories of Black and colored Lewis never disappears. And these are some of the things that we are working on. And I wanted to say that I love to have anyone who has Facebook go onto the Memories of Lewis, ask to join. And I will accept you as a member. Now, just know that the Facebook page is dedicated to the memories of the African American community in Lewis. I want to thank you for allowing me to share these memories. And again, remember to go onto our Facebook page and you'll see a whole lot of pictures, and they will be expanded. They won't be as small as they were on this presentation. You'll see them. And also that the Lewis African American Heritage Commission is always looking for volunteers to assist in our ongoing projects. You can contact me or any member of the commission. My information is here. We meet on the third Thursday of the month at 6 o'clock. And I wanted to say goodbye. And thank you. And yep, that's me. Once again, thank you for this opportunity. Take care and God bless.
I want to thank the audience for tuning in to our town hall tonight, and special thanks to our speakers, Sil Wolford, Reverend George H. Edwards Sr., and Trina Brown Hicks. Thank you and good night.